Welcome back to Lend Me Your Ear. Sect 2 of Chapter 2. Histories generally give us only two accounts: why people removed from one country to another, either not or thinly inhabited, whether driven by force or of their own accord so as to unburden and give ease to their too plethoric country. Thus the banished Japanese forsook their native country and settled themselves in a desolate soil, since it was a flourishing empire, shining with riches and crowned with stately cities. So the Batavians took possession of the uninhabited isle lying between the Rhine and the Wayal, being driven out of Hessen by civil wars, and preserved the memory of the place from whence they had their original on the utmost point of the island, in the villages of Kattenwick. Formerly went by the name of Catti. Others that removed did not only fall upon their neighbours, but made away by force of arms, choosing their habitations under a temperate climate and in a fruitful soil. In this manner the Franks entered Gaul, and afterwards the Normans set upon France, so that the conquered countries have ever since been called France and Normandy by the conquerors. But although it cannot be punctually said how the inhabitants of America removed, it is without contradiction that they first found an empty country. The opinions that they themselves have concerning it are full of idle fancies. First, they question their origin from the flood, which is so well rooted in the memory of all nations that the blindest and most ignorant know something of it, though deformedly altered and varied, tacked up with additional fabulous stories. The truth itself is known not only to us, but to all others lost in oblivion. Who has not heard of Deucalion's flood, how his wife Pyrrha and he only escaped in a little boat and, as it's fabled, landed on a mountain, from there populating the world again by throwing stones backwards over their head. Something of this seems to hint at the true story of Noah, his wife and children, from whom the desolated world was replenished. The same they relate of Prometheus, concerning whom, thus Diodorus Siculus. They say that the Nile, breaking through his dams and overflowing his banks, drowned all of Egypt, especially that part where Prometheus ruled, where all the inhabitants were swallowed by the deluge. None can imagine but that Diodorus by this makes mention of a particular flood and not the general, one in Noah's time, for as the Greeks ascribed all things to their heroes, so the Egyptians in like manner did the same to theirs. Therefore, the general flood made a particular one in Egypt, though perhaps it never was. So what is fabled of Prometheus is nothing but a part of the universal deluge, which the name Prometheus proves, because it signifies sprung from heaven, and is the same with Noah, whom they hold to be the first father of all mankind since the flood, born of or regenerated from his wife Asia, and Asia signifies earth or the mother of all things. And so, espousing Noah, being sprung from God to Ararat, from whence descended the generations of mankind, and by degrees spread over the whole surface of the earth. The Chinese, East Indians, Japanese, and other people of Asia and Africa also have some knowledge of a very ancient flood, but are hoodwinked under many idle fancies, not unlike that to which the Americans relate, from whom several learned persons find no obscure confessions of the deluge, which thus mystically they have wrapped up. That one Viracocha came out of the great lake Titicaca and settled his residence upon Tiahuanaco, where yet remain the ruins of ancient walls built in a wonderful manner. At length, removing from Tiahuanaco to Cusco, he began to multiply the generations of mankind. They show in the aforementioned lake a small island under which the Americans say the sun saved himself from the flood. Therefore, in ancient times, they superstitiously observed that place, heightening their bloody sacrifices with human slaughter. Others relate that 6 persons leapt through a hole out of a window, from whence all men were since extracted, and from that new increase, the place, after the inhabitants of the old world were all drowned, got the denomination of Pacari Tempo, and therefore they hold Tempos to be the most ancient families. From this, Mango Capam is derived, being the primogenitor of the Incas, or kings, from whom sprung 2 generations, Hanon Cusco and Urim Cusco. They also tell us that their Incas, when they make war upon any people, say that the occasion, as they pretend, was because all territories are tributary to them justly, from whom they were derived and restored, being the first planters of the new world, and withal, that the true religion was declared to them from heaven. This relation, though mixed with fables, shows, but very darkly, that they have some knowledge of the flood, For who are those 6 others who leapt out of a window to replenish the generations of mankind but Shem, Ham, and Japheth with their wives? The Americans can give a little better account of their first original, and indeed it is no wonder, because, for want of books, they can relate nothing certain, but only what they have registered in their usual Quipokamagos, which is not above 400 years old. Acosta asked what original. They judged. They were of, and from what country and people they derived. I received no other answer but that America was their only native country, and that they were derived from no other place. But though the Peruvians are of this opinion, yet the Mexicans are of another mind, giving the Spaniards a far better account when first they came thither, wherein we must a little deviate, namely how they were removed from some other place, as Robert Conteus relates, who with many learned and seemingly true arguments affirms that the original of the Americans must be sought for either among the Phoenicians, Sidonians, Tyrians, or Carthaginians, being indeed all one people. Herodotus says thus of the Phoenicians: they lived formerly, according to their own relations, along the shore of the Red Sea, from whence they removed and planted the seacoast of the Syrians. Faustus Avienus, the Latin poet, agrees with this opinion, where he says, on the Phoenicians' coasts the ocean beats, who through the Red Sea sailing, changed their seat. They were the first that ventured through the seas, and freighted ships with richer merchandise. Fair or foul weather, they without control sought foreign trade, directed by the pole. Aristotle, from a Greek word, calls them Phoenicians, from their being red or bloody with the slaughter of all strangers that landed on their coast. But rather, and so indeed they are called Phoenicians or Eritreans, from Esau, or Eritreans, from Esau or Edom, from whom they are derived. Denominations signify in Greek red, the two last alike in Hebrew. Phoenix himself first planted all the country lying between the river Eleutherus and the Egyptian city Pelusium, and afterwards Damiata, washed by the Mediterranean. But since then these boundaries have been altered: on the north by Judea, westward by the Mediterranean, southerly by Egypt, and towards the east by desert Arabia. The chiefest cities are Ptolemais, otherwise called Acon, Sidon, Arad, Great Cana, Sarepta, Byblus, Bothrit, Berithus, and their princess Tyre, formerly situated on an island but since joined to the mainland by Alexander the Great. None can disown the fact that the Phoenicians have always been admirals of the sea, so formidable were they to the greatest princes. When the Persian king Cambyses came with a vast army against the Carthaginians, he was forced to give over his design because the Phoenicians refused to help him with their fleet, being allied to them and the city founded by them. But they not only built Carthage, which strove with Rome to be the empress of the world, but also the famous cities Leptis, Utica, Hippo, and Hadrumetum in Africa, and Cadiz and Tartessus in Spain. Nay, they sent plantations of people into the heart of Iberia and Libya. It will not be amiss to add Q, Curtius's relation, who tells us, wherever the Phoenicians came with their fleets, landing their men, they subdued whole countries, and, by that means, spread their colonies over the known world: Carthage in Africa, Thebes in Boeotia, and Cadiz near the Western Ocean. Aristotle relates that they made such rich returns of their merchandise, and chiefly of their oil, in Spain, that their anchors, pins, and all iron materials belonging to a ship, instead of that metal, were silver. But to return to our discourse and disprove the former testimony that the Phoenicians found America, the aforementioned Conteus says thus: none can justly doubt but that since the Phoenicians took the command of the sea from the Rhodians, they more and more increased their fleets and became expert in navigation, passing the Gibraltar northward, becoming masters of Cadiz, and still prepared new fleets, which, searching beyond Atlas, southward discovered the coasts of Africa and the adjacent isles, driving a great trade to the Canaries and to those which lay scattered along Cape de Verde, formerly called the Gorgades. This way of trading was also not unknown to the Greeks, Iberians, and other people, but after the Phoenicians assumed it wholly to themselves. Without any respect or difference of countries, they sank all whomsoever they could catch. Curtius further adds, saying, I believe that the Phoenicians sailing into the main ocean have discovered unknown countries, and which are those, not the Gorgades or Canary Isles, for those were sufficiently known before, but a mainland far beyond. But though the Phoenicians were the most experts, they were not skilled enough to make such discoveries. They indeed were the first two, before any other sailed out of the Midland Sea. Nay, they ventured a good way into the main ocean, beyond the Straits of Gibraltar or the Herculean Pillars. But how far? Not to the Gorgades, above halfway between Spain and America, but to the Cassiterides, or Flemish Islands, which to the number of 9 lie in sight of Spain. Strabo affirms this truth, saying,
"The Cassiterides are 10, lying in order close to one another. One remains uninhabited. On the rest live a swarthy people."
This way the Phoenicians sailed first when they were in quest for trade, from Cadiz, and though he reckons 10, there are indeed but 9, namely Saint Michael, Saint Mary, St. George, Tercera, de Pico or Tenerife, so called from the mountain which vomits fire, Fayal, Las Flores, Del Corvo and Hippopotami or seahorses. Atzama is held to flow from the same fountain from which the Nile has its origin. In this latitude, Hanno described those islands that he called Gorgones from the 3 deformed sisters Medusa, Sthenio and Euryale, whose heads were periwigged with curled serpents because they found ill-favoured women on these islands, which the Hollanders now call the Salt Islands, amongst which the chiefest is St. Jago, a colony of the Portuguese. But the mountains opposite to the Gorgones, on the main coast of Africa, rising aloft with spiring tops near the river Masithalus, which Hanno called the Chariots of the Gods, are now named Sierra Leone, lying at 8 degrees northern latitude. When Hanno and his armada, either provoked by undaunted courage or covetous of fame, proceeded in their so wonderful adventure, they reported that they saw rivers of fire falling into the ocean, the country all about burning and the tops of the mountains dazzling their eyes with continual flashes of lightning intermixed with terrible thunder, adding further that they saw rivers of fire falling into the ocean, the country all about burning and the tops of the mountains dazzling their eyes with continual flashes of lightning, intermixed with terrible thunder, adding further that the natives all summer sheltered themselves from the excessive heat in caves underground, and coming forth in the night ran abroad with lighted torches over their ground, so gathering in their harvest and officiating all other affairs of husbandry. Yet Hanno, not daunted by such strange sights, sailed from Sierra Leone southerly to the equinox, where he discovered an island not far from the African coast inhabited by a rough and hairy people, to take some of whom he used all possible means, but could not. Encompassed by soldiers were taken and carried aboard, but being very savage and barbarously wild, they could not be tamed or brought to any complacency. So they killed them and carried their stuffed-up skins to Carthage, where they were long gazed upon with great admiration. This island, which Hanno then found, can be no other but that which we call St. Thomas, and has a very unhealthy air for strangers, but is otherwise very fruitful and abounding with sugar canes. And the hairy people that he makes mention of were baboons, which Africa in this place breeds large, to the amazement of the beholders, in great abundance, because those deform. Monsters, more than any other beast whatsoever, represent human shape. Here Hanno stopped his voyage, being hindered from going further for want of provisions. 5 years he spent on this expedition before he anchored again at Cadiz, from whence not long after he steered to his native country, Carthage, where he was received with no less wonder than state, insomuch that none before or after him ever gained greater honour, seeming to oblige his country, with the hopes of future profits from these newly discovered regions. Nay, he received a name and was placed amongst their gods in the temples, which, being ambitious, he promoted after a strange manner, teaching several birds to cry, "The great god Hanno," which, when they could speak perfectly, they were let fly in the air, where, to the admiration of all people, they everywhere repeated their well-taught lesson. This is the most remarkable voyage that happened in the time of the ancients, considering they wanted several mathematical instruments belonging to navigation and especially the use of the compass, and also considering the length of the voyage to Sierra Leone, where no one has ventured before. Nay, in so many ages after Hanno, the most famous navigators who were set out by the King of Portugal feared a long time to cut their passage through the Great Ocean. Moreover, the same Strabo relates that the Carthaginians did not throw overboard the traders on the remote Gorgades, but especially those that came from Sardinia or Cadiz. Meanwhile, we cannot deny but that the Gorgades that lie before Cape de Verde were frequented by the Carthaginians long before the birth of our Saviour, but with so much admiration that Hanno, their captain in that expedition, was listed amongst the number of their heroes, happening thus. The Carthaginians, sailing for Cadiz to assist the Phoenicians against the Spaniards, made that the seat of war, which soon drew on a greater design. Hamilcar and Hanno, empowered by the Senate at Carthage, managed the war in Spain. Both of them were ambitious about discovering new countries. Hamilcar sailed along the coast of Spain and Gaul, reaching Batavia. Hanno steered southerly, carrying 30,000 men of all trades in his fleet, purposing to build a new city in some place or other, and got beyond the promontory Ampelusium, now called Cabo Spatil. The river Xylo washes the city Azilla and the streamlets, now Lusso, where the poets placed the gardens of the Hesperides in the custody of a waking dragon. From there, proceeding on his voyage, he came to an anchor in the mouth of the river Suba, at this day called Subu, and afterwards before the city Sala, now called Salé, which at that time was made very dangerous by the voracious beasts in the neighbouring woods. At last, the fleet reached the foot of the Lesser Atlas, which ends at the point Chonaria, which the modern navigators called Cabo Non, because it was judged that no one could escape with life's toughest adventure to steer beyond Chonaria. Yet Hanno sailed between Palma, one of the Canary Islands, and the promontory Borgadores, towards the pointed coast, called then Cornu Hesperium, but now Capo Verde in the river Asama by Castaldas, called Omirabi. Here he found horrible crocodiles and hippopotami, or sea horses. Here Hanno stopped his voyage, being hindered from going further for want of provision. 5 years he spent in this expedition before he anchored again at Cadiz, from whence, not long after, he steered to his native country Carthage, where he was received with no less wonder than state, in summa, that none before or after him ever gained greater honour, seeming to oblige his country with the hopes of future profits from these newly discovered regions. He received a name and was placed amongst their gods in the temples, which, being ambitious of, he promoted after a strange manner, teaching several birds to cry, the great god Hanno, which, when they could speak perfectly, they were let fly in the air, where, to the admiration of all people, they everywhere repeated their well-taught lesson. Hanno's voyage was 400 years before the birth of our Saviour. Therefore, if no one had been further than Hanno until the time the Portuguese sailed beyond Cape de Buena, Esperanza, how could America be discovered by sea? How did they steer from the Salt Islands or St. Thomas, out of sight of land, through the main ocean to an unknown world? Hanno himself, who was the stoutest of all ancient navigators, not only crept along the African coast, which made him spend so much time, but also, not daring to cross over those wide-spreading bays he found, left his hold of the shore and measured and searched every winding inlet and creek. And if he found a new world, why was it not known? The more, because his ambition carried him on to get a name and reputation by such naval discoveries, and how true the relation of this expedition is, Pliny tells us, saying,
"The journal," books were then to be seen in which Hanno wrote in that his African expedition, though many of the Greeks, and also of our moderns following Hanno, have found several things contrary to his observations, wherein he makes mention of several cities built by him, which none ever, since heard of or any have seen, neither is there the least marks of their ruins to be found.
This large relationship serves for nothing else but to show that they seek in vain herein to give the honour of the discovery of America to the ancients, and as little do those testimonies signify that they are taken from Diodorus Siculus, Pliny, Pomponius Mela, and Allelan. Our time to hear every one of them. First, Diodorus saith,
"Beyond Libya, in the ocean, lies a very great island, several days' sailing in circumference, having a very fruitful soil and pleasant meadows, distinguished by hills and moistened by navigable rivers, unknown in ancient times because it seems to be separated from the other world and was thus found. The Phoenicians, sailing along the Libyan coast, were several days and nights tossed with perpetual tempests, and at last driven to the aforementioned island, where anchoring and observing the pleasant situation thereof made it known to their magistrates."
But how does this nameless island become America? What man would take that for an island that far exceeds the main continent of Asia, and have the Phoenicians attributed the discovery of this new world to anyone? Whence then proceeds such great silence amongst all the ancient writers of the whole world, who otherwise used to give denominations to the least remote village, mountain, or river? Cody speaks after the same manner, saying,
The writers make mention that Atlas rises out of the middle of the sands, with a shrubby and bushy top towards the sky, on the shore of the ocean, to which he gives his denomination, that it is full of woods and watered by several fountains on that side, towards Africa, by which means it bears all. Manner of fruit. In the daytime, none of the inhabitants appear, all things being in silence as in the middle of a desert. The approach is struck with sudden amazement, and besides its excessively high crown, reaching above the clouds and neighbouring, as they say, the circle of the moon. It appears in the night as if it were all in a flame, resounding far and near with pipes, trumpets, and cymbals, and the journey up thither very long and dangerous. I cannot understand that Pliny can mean America by this, because himself, in the first division of his 5th book, makes its beginning with the description of Africa, and as to what further concerns the strange relation and danger thereof, is a little before related in Hanno's voyage, and it is but a slight argument to prove it to America, because it seems to resonate with those sorts of instruments which the Americans were observed to use when discovered. Pomponius Mela, being the third, has no greater arguments than the former.
We hear,
Says he,
that utmost people towards the west, being the Atlanticans, are rather half beasts than men, cloven-footed without heads, their faces upon their breasts, and naked with one great foot, like satyrs or goblins, which range up and down without any artificial shelters or houses.
Lastly, Aelian seems to say something when he sets down the discourse between Midas and Silenus out of Theopompus, where Silenus relates it
that Europe, Asia, and Libya are islands, and that a vast country lies beyond this triple divided world, mighty populous and abounding with all other living creatures, as big again as ours, and living twice as long, that they are wondrous rich, their religions, laws, and customs founded upon another morality and reason quite different from ours. They boast especially of 2 great cities, Machimus and Eusebes. The inhabitants of the first maintained themselves by driving altogether a trade of war, mustering up, and filling their numerous regiments with several valiant nations. The listed citizens amount in their muster rolls, all bred to soldiery, to 2 millions, of whom few but scorn, either dying bravely by wounds received with flint-edged laths and staves, instead of spears pointed with stones, not knowing the use of iron or steel, but so overstocked with gold and silver that they account it a drug of less value than our basest metal. Some years later they marched into our world 100,000 strong, as far as the Hyperborean mountains, where, being informed that all the nations of our world, compared with them, lived in a poor and despicable condition, as not thinking them worth their conquest, they returned. But the second city, Eusebes, deals altogether in peace, and its citizens are not rapacious, but exercise justice, so much affecting morality and divine worship that they conquer heaven by their piety and meekness, and the gods themselves are pleased to descend and advise with them concerning their celestial affairs.
who observes not this to be a poetical relation, showing how much better the acquirements of peace are than those of war, the one conquering only men, the other the god. Nor can more be taken out of Aelian's discourse than that the ancients believed there was another habitable world to be our antipodes. Thus far, much has been disputed concerning the origin of the Americans, whose plantations from Tyre or Carthage by sea are found altogether invalid. Yet we will search a little further to see whether the people analogize, either in their religion, policy, economy, or custom. It is certain that the ancient Phoenicians lived in tents and sometimes exchanged eaten-up pastures for fresh, which the Americans to this day observe, by which it might appear that they are of a Phoenician extract. Patriarchs who all lived such an unsettled, wandering life. Besides, the Phoenicians had for a long time given over pastoral business to maritime affairs of greater consequence, not only merchandising throughout the world, but sending great colonies in ships to new plantations. Ancestors but would have built great cities like them, of which many were found in Phoenicia, but none of antiquity in America. As to their religion, if it agreed with the Phoenicians, it was the same that all the world professed at that time, and therefore may as well be extracted from any other as well. It's true, we find them inclined to sorcery and dealing with evil spirits, as did the Phoenicians, of which they were not only guilty, but all other nations at that time. Why not as well transport it out of Asia or Europe, where there were formerly many like tamperers and those that dealt in such diabolical sciences? And why not from Salmantica, where, as Laurentius Ananius relates, magic arts were publicly taught, and they commenced as doctors and took their degrees according to their learning? The devil also has public worship amongst the Americans, as he did with the Phoenicians. Yet not only they, but the whole world had dedicated temples to him. Here began humane and infernal sacrifices, supposing that evil spirits were delighted and so feasted with the steam of humane offerings, whose sweetness made them milder and so intoxicating lulled them into less mischief. How famous are Zoroaster and the whole school of Eastern magicians! In Moses' time, this wickedness had already taken place, nor can it be denied but that the Phoenicians carried their idols in their ships, as Herodotus testifies, saying,
"The image of Vulcan much resembles the Phoenicians' Patakoiawai, which they placed on the forecastle of their ships."
In like manner, the Americans, when they go to sea, carry their idols with them, and the ships take their names from the image, which is either painted or carved on the stern or placed elsewhere upon the deck. The same custom the Chinese observe to this present. Francis Xavier relates
that he sailed in a Chinese vessel from Goa to Japan, which bore an idol in its stern, before which the master lighted candles, perfumed it with aloe, wood, and offered birds and other food, inquiring of it at the event of his voyage. Sometimes he judged from the statue's immovable looks that it would turn out successfully, and other times not.
Lastly, Porphyrius relates
that the Phoenicians, upon any great exigency as war, excessive heat, or mortal distempers, by order selected one of the most comely and beautiful of their children to be offered up to Saturn.
And Eusebius also says out of Porphyrius that Saturn, whom the Phoenicians call Israel, the learned Vossius and Hugo Grotius read Il or El, one of the 10 names of God in Hebrew, which they also give to the planet Saturn, who, when he reigned in Phoenicia, having one only son born by the nymph Oberet, and was in danger to lose his kingdom, being worsted in an unlucky war, he dressed him in royal robes, and placing him on an altar built for that purpose, sacrificed him with his own hands. And although such cruel oblations are used in America, must it therefore follow that they are derived from the Phoenicians when several other people are guilty of the same? Nay, there is scarcely one country that has not, at some time or another, performed such inhumane acts, seeming to them to be zealous in their religion. For the most eminent of the heathens scruple not at it, which certainly are held to be the Persians, Greeks, and Romans, and yet they were not abhorred, though they committed humane slaughters. This holy butchery and religious slaughter of mankind began in Rome. The Emperor Adrian's reign, continuing till the time of Tertullian, Lactantius, and Eusebius, the Greeks, who inhabited the utmost part of Italy, employed themselves daily in sacrificing strangers to Saturn, and sometimes one another, but at last this formal cruelty became a ridiculous custom, for the Romans by severe edicts strictly forbade all such humane offerings. Yet, to retain some memory of their former sacrifices, they ordered 30 images to be made of rushes, which every year on the 15th of April were, by the Roman priests and Vestal nuns, to be thrown from the Milvian bridge into the Tiber. Moreover, Manethan relates that the Egyptians in Heliopolis used to offer 3 men at once to Juno, which custom was observed till King Amasis ordered that instead of men they should serve her with wax candle. Amistris, queen to the famous Xerxes, caused 12 men to be burned alive as an obligation to pacify and oblige Pluto to maintain them in their present grandeur. Procopius tells of the people about the Arabian Gulf that they often sacrificed men to the sun. The Indians, says Pomponius Mela, killed their nearest relatives and parents before they decayed by sickness or age, and judged it fit and most religious to feast and banquet themselves with the entrails of the slain. The Albanians, as Strabo relates, offer yearly one of their priests to the moon. The same Mela relates of the Tory that they used to cut the throats of strangers whenever they came near the place of their sacrifice. The Egyptian idol Typhon, as you may read in Manetho, was daily made red hot, and living people were put in and broiled to death. But to pass by several other people guilty of such bloody idolatry, how did the altars erected in the woods in Gaul and Germany for Taran, Hesus, Teutates, and Woden continually smoke with the blood of humane expiations, of which Caesar says thus in his commentaries,
"The Gauls are a very devout and superstitious nation, and therefore when any were dangerously sick or likely to be worsted in battle, they vowed to feast their gods that saved them with human flesh, and if need be, would make themselves a thankful sacrifice to those that helped them off in such an exigency. Concerning these bloody rites they consulted and employed the Druids, on whose advice they all believed that no victim was so acceptable to humans as poured out humane blood, but especially that of malefactors. If they could not procure this dainty, their gods must be treated with the lives of the innocent."
Lastly, the Holy Scripture says thus, when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too sore for him, he took with him 700 men that drew swords to break through even to the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his eldest son, who should have reigned in his stead, and offered him for a burnt offering on the wall. These testimonies are sufficient witnesses that the ancient heathens expressed the height of their devotion and fury of mad zeal in such execrable rites that, to this day, the like is practiced by the Indians, Chinese, Japanese, and this proves that the Americans are derived from the Phoenicians because of their human sacrifices, for those were usual customs in all places. The third proof they offer us is borrowed from the similitude and likeness of the Phoenician and American languages. Concois sets down some words, namely, the Phoenicians called a mountain Abila, blood Edom, a mother Anak, a maid Helotia, water Haney, and jam. With the first agrees the American Anthla. With the first agrees the American Anthla. With the third Anum, with the fourth Helotai, with the fifth Am. Thus corrupt, the words may as well make unseemly comparisons. It is certain that the Phoenicians and some of the Americans call a cup Assur, and red wine Belesa. But does it or follow that one is extracted from the other? How many names signify the same thing among people who have never had any conversation together? This proceeds only from a mere accident. Or else, if some words of one language sound like the same words used in a remote country and have the same meaning, must they therefore be derived from one another? Then, by necessity, the Greeks, Latins, and Germans had their origins from the Hebrews, or the Latins from the Greeks, or the Germans from the Latins, or the Persians from the Germans. On the contrary, the last owe their extract to the first. Number as a testimony and to give you a pattern. How little difference is there in many words between Greek and Hebrew? The Hebrews call a church congregation Sanhedrin, the Greeks ecclesia, ecclesia, ecclesia. The Greeks, for I advise, use somboloi, sombuluyu, the other bulu, buluo, buluo. The Hebrews call wise men Zophei, the other Sophoi, 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 Zaphoi, well, Sophoi, and there is less difference between Symphonia, a well-set lesson, or Santoren, Psalterium, a spiritual hymn, and who will not find a near resemblance in the consonnating of various Latin and Hebrew words, for there is little difference between mesura, a mensura, a measure, shekarus, a measure, secarus, a sweet moisture, levia, a lioness, sabeka, and sambuca, a chopping board, pisa, and passus, a pain. Similarly, when starting over with Greek and Latin, the Teutonics would likewise produce many words that have the same sound and meaning as Hebrew. For example, shobel, ethmol, a cable, ethmol, a cable, ethmol, and sotin, sotim, edruad, Dutch, erde, or in English, eardlands, furt and peert, a horse, lavia, and leviu, a lion, shard, and shadia, damages, kisser, and kusen, in our dialect the very same kisses, and kusen, and schenken, a giving from which we derive our English skinker, from serving drink, bell, and beal, an image for bet, properly signifies lord, perhaps because the images of heroes or lords were worshipped by them, or else because Ninus first erected an image for his father Belus or Bel to be worshipped. It would make a large volume itself to enumerate the consonances of Hebrew, Greek, and Latin and their scatterings among all languages wherever their empire spread. They are indeed borrowed from one another, as are all languages that deal with or have any conversation with each other. Only do the words, with some small alterations of letters, signify the same in both languages, but they also do so without the least alteration. Both Greeks and Latins express I do by ago, the number 8 by octo, an arm by brachium, or brachio, in English branches and braces I eat by edo, a cup by file, a curtain by cortine, or cortine, merry by hilaris, or hilaros, a rattling noise or sound by clangor, a camel by camelus, or camelos, a knee by genu, or gonu, a bowl or chalice by calyx, a bowl or chalice by calyx, a bowl or chalice by calyx, a dulus, a house by domus, or pharaoh, the pronoun I by ego, a lion by leo, or leon, flax by linium, or linon, a mother by mater, or man, the night by nux or nux, a rockstone by petra, a nickname by scoma or scoma, a boat by scapha or scapha, by Tesha, by the saurus or the saurus, father by pater, I tremble by tremor, I tremo by tremor, I tremo, I hour by hora, the evening by vespera or hespera, signification in both. Now, if there is not the 100th part of the resemblance found between the American and Phoenician tongues, as there is between the Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Dutch, according to the aforementioned examples, which notwithstanding cannot be observed to be derived from one another, what testimony cannot be observed to one another? What testimony can? There be in 5 or 6 words that only have a few letters that do not differ, but suppose that the agreeing of the Phoenician and American tongues could serve as a testimony that these last people had their original from the first, then there remains another doubt. To know what Americans acknowledge the Phoenicians for their fathers, because their country is so big that it may almost stand in competition with all the other 3 parts of the known world, being divided by so many nations, which differ not only in their various customs, but also in their several languages, most of them not having the least likeness to one another. Oftentimes the inhabitants of one province differ so much in dialect that, according to Petrus de Sieca, one cannot understand the other. John de Laet observes out of Peter Martyr and other writers concerning the West Indies that there are several languages and strange words spoken among the diverse inhabitants of America. For the Hurons call a head Sionta, the Mexicans Stonta Contli, the inhabitants of New Netherlands Unsite, the Brazilians Akanga, the Jaos Bope in figures 1, 2, 3, and 4. The Huronese tell thus: Escate Teni Hachin Dak, the Mexicans Si Ome Yai Nahui, the Sankey Kaz Kote Nisi Nacha Wive, the Brazilians Oyep Mokaya Mokapaya, the Jaos Tuain Tage Tero, the natives of New Netherland Onsat Tigani Ase Kayer. Moreover, the Hurones call a father Aistam, the Mexicans Tathli, the Canadenses Notauvi, in New Netherland Regina, in Brazil Tubar, and so it is generally with all other words, which agree not in the least one with the other, so that every terracetary hath not only a several dialect, but in many places they use besides 2, 3, or more distinct speeches, not relating in the least one to another, in one province by which the people inhabiting towns and villages are distinguished. The islanders discovered by the Spaniards and destroyed have left few words behind them, yet Peter Martyr sets down some of them, which were formerly used in Hispaniola. They called heaven Turas, a house bow, gold, corny, a good man, Tano. It is worthy of observation that they pronounce no H in their language, but what is spoken with a vowel, and then give it a strong aspiration. The Phoenicians, descendants from Sidon, say they peopled America. The Spaniards, sprung from Tubal of Japhet, have subjected the Americans descended from Sidon of Canaan, wherein is fulfilled that prophecy of Moses that Canaan should be servant to Japhet. But it seems a great mistake, so to derive the Phoenicians from Canaan, for they are extracted from Shem, Heber, Abraham, and Esau, surnamed Edom, from his saying Adom, Adam, when he asked of Jacob, that read, because he knew not how to call the prepared pottage by its proper name, and Edom settling himself on Mount Seir, a part of the stony Arabia, and on the coast of the Red Sea, gave denomination to it, because that sea was much frequented and navigated by his successors. The Greeks call it Erythrium, from Erythros, who is the same as Esau, and likewise signifies red. Hereto is added that the phoenix and Erythros have the same signification in the Greek. So then these Idumeans, taking the name of Phoenicians from the great phoenix, spread themselves far, and near under mighty kings by navigation in the Red Sea, and from thence planted several coasts and islands, removing at last to Syria. The seventh king of Edom Moses reckons to be Baal-Hanan, whose name, by transposing the syllables, the famous Carthaginian general Hannibal bore. Moreover, it may easily be demonstrated that the Phoenicians extracted from Heber have formerly spoken Hebrew and Arabic, for they dwelt before there. Removal in the stony Arabia. St. Jerome says, the Punic tongue agrees for the most part with the Hebrew, and St. Augustine tells us that many, nay, most of the Carthaginian words are Hebrew. Elisa Dido, the first foundress of Carthage, proves this for Elisa or Elissa with the Hebrews, denotes a lamb of my God, and Dido, a lover, but who can find the least likeness between the Hebrew or Arabic, tongue with the Americans. Lastly, since the Phoenicians acknowledge Esau as a father, what then concerns the Americans, the curse of Canaan, since they are no more extracted from Canaan than the Phoenicians? Thus much concerning the Phoenicians. Some would derive the Americans from the Jews, others from the 10 tribes of Israel carried into captivity, the ground of which opinions is that the Jews and Israelites were scattered amongst all nations. Therefore they conclude that America was also peopled by them, rather because the ancient Jews and Americans were of one complexion, and went alike, both going without shoes, only wearing sandals and an upper coat over a shorter linen vest. Both are humble, quick of apprehension and obliging, yet valiant, but it is certain they cannot be like the Jews, because the Americans change their habits, as they live in cold or hot countries, and go not in the least like one another. Father Emmanuel relates that he saw a Brazilian not only stoutly make his party good against 3 Portugal soldiers, but had it not been by mere chance, worsted them. Lastly, what ceremonies of religious rites are observed by the Americans, which are used in Judaism? The Jews indeed have transplanted their circumcision amongst diverse Eastern people, and have they only forgotten the first ceremony and signal badge of their religion in America, which yet not only they, but those Muslims and other sectarians punctually observe? This makes evident their scatterings about the face of the earth, but it will not bring them to America. The sacred text sets forth a 2-fold description of the Jews, the one before the birth of our Saviour, when they lived as strangers in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Jerusalem was their metropolis, although others had their chief residence in Babylon and Alexandria. For there was an Asiatic and a European dispersion. Those of Asia had Babylon as their chief city and used in their synagogues the Chaldean translation of the Bible. Seat at Alexandria, where they had a temple like that of Jerusalem, and while they employed themselves in the Greek version of the Holy Scripture by the 72 interpreters under Ptolemy Philadelphus, they were called Wandering Greeks. Therefore, certainly the Americans are not derived from these Jews, and with as little reason from those who, by Titus Vespasian, after the destruction of Jerusalem, were driven into several countries, for they were never permitted, that I may borrow the words of St. Cyprian, to set forward one step, though as pilgrims, towards their native country, but strictly forbidden not to assemble or meet together in any considerable number, which would have been necessary if they intended to plant a new world. A small seeming testimony is added, taken out of the 4th book of Esdras, that the 10 tribes of Israel that were carried away by Salmanassar with their king Hosea to Nahala Habor, the river Gozan, and the cities of the Medes might be acknowledged as the first planters of America. Concerning which, Esdras says thus, the 10 tribes brought over into another country, consulted that they should forsake the multitude of the heathens, and travel to a remote country, where no generation of mankind had ever lived before, where they would maintain their laws, which they had not observed in their country. Whereupon they went thither through the narrow entrances of the river Euphrates, for the Almighty stopped the veins of the river till they were passed over, for through the country was a way of 1.5 years' journey. Wherefore that tract of land is called Asareth, and then they lived there till the last time. But since these books of Esdras were not written by a prophet, either in the Hebrew tongue, or allowed by the Jews to be the word of God, or anywhere taken notice of in the New Testament, why then is Asareth more America than any other remote country? St. Jerome, who certainly had a peculiar knowledge of the condition of the 10 tribes of Israel, because he lived in Asia and held correspondence with the Jews, that he might perfectly learn the Hebrew tongue, relates that the 10 tribes St. Jerome lived about the year 400 under the Emperor Theodosius underwent great slavery in the cities of Medes and Persians, so that this strange voyage to Asareth, which must have happened long before St. Jerome's time, may be recorded amongst the other legends of the rabbis concerning their Behemoth and Leviathan, who locked up the souls of those that slighted their laws in caves underground, as Esdras, and how little opportunity the Israelites had to remove since his time may appear by the horrible destruction that was made for several ages together in Persia and Media. For although the Persians became masters again of the realm, conquered by Alexander the Great, whilst Alexander's successor invaded one another, yet they were continually in war, either against the Romans or else the Indians and other eastern people. Nay, the Saracens wrested the sceptre out of their hand, though but for a small time, for soon after, breaking out into factions amongst themselves, Mukshum et Sabiktigin, Israel's son established his throne on their ruins, and encouraged by such success, armed himself against the Indians and made use of the Turks' assistance, with which he subdued the Babylonian Arabians, after which the Turks, not without great slaughter, set the Persian crown on their head, which immediately tottered by bloody commotions. For Tangralippix, being king of Persia, clashing with his brother Karplumazes, made Persia swim in the blood of a civil war, till at last Genghis Khan brought from Tartary so great an army, anno 1200, that none durst stay to make opposition. For the Turks forsook Persia after a conquest of 6 ages, and made their own way for new quarters into Carmania, Phrygia, and Bithynia, whence they made such incursions on the Greek Empire that at last they became sole masters thereof. Who cannot but easily judge by this how little opportunity the 10 tribes had to be assembled together from remote countries, and to go on long journeys through untracked ways and full of enemies to travel to America. Emmanuel de Morales, who had gotten peculiar knowledge of the Americans from his long conversation with them, judges that they are not derived from one people but from the Carthaginians and Jews, and that at several times and places they landed in this new world, for the Carthaginians sailing. Thither found the soil so fertile that many forsook their native country to dwell there, whereupon it was forbidden upon pain of death to send no more thither, lest if Carthage should be invaded by a foreign enemy, it should want people for a home defence. From this occasion, it happened that those that were already transported became rude and of a savage disposition, and spreading their families planted the desolate countries in a ranging manner, without acknowledging any supreme head or governor. Thus being scattered up and down, everyone invented to himself a new language, which should neither agree with the Carthaginians nor any other. But this opinion is before at large contradicted. Moreover, Morales endeavors to show that the Brazilians are of a Hebrew extract, because, according to the example of the Jews, they might not marry but in their own tribes. They also call their uncles, fathers, and their aunts, mothers. Both mourn for the dead a month together and wear long garments down to their ankles. But these arguments seem to us of little consequence, for indeed the Brazilians differ in their marriages from the Jews, for they not only marry in their own tribes, but frequently mix with their sisters and daughters or other their nearest relations, from whose loins they sprang many ages before, as well as their uncles, which the Americans do not. The mourning for the dead has been an old custom and is not observed by many people, but the time of a month was not settled amongst them, but was observed after a more unusual manner, 70 days, as in the fields of Moab for Moses, and elsewhere for the patriarch Jacob. Lastly, all people know that the Romans and Persians girt themselves about with long clothes. Besides, the Jews were strictly bound to observe circumcision, without which they were not accounted Jews, which the Brazilians do not use, as neither their language or letters. How is it possible that in America they should at once have forgotten their extracts, laws, circumcision, language, and other ceremonies, when the rest of them observed nothing more strictly in all parts of the earth? Hugo Grotius, in his inquiry after the original of the Americans, brings them with many circumstances to belong to Panama, situated opposite to the northern parts of Norway, because something of their languages agrees, and the way thither is easy and nearest to be found. From Norway to Iceland, over which the Norwegians ruled above 1,000 years since, so from Iceland through Friesland to Greenland, and from thence to Estethailand, being a part of the main continent of America. From Friesland, some fishermen went thither, as he says, 2 centuries before the Spaniards touched that shore, which John de Laet contradicts him. And indeed, what reasons can be given why the Americans of the Straits between Panama and Nombre de Dios, lying northerly, should have another original than those that live to the south, seeing that the same straits are neither divided by mountains or rivers, and the Spaniards found no alteration in the customs and languages between them that lived above or below these straits? And who will believe that Norway, which was but indifferently populated, could afford such numerous colonies as could plant Northern America, which far exceeds the south, and chiefly when the great islands that lie near the east and west are added to it? Moreover, it is certain, if the Icelander Angrim Jonas is to be credited, that some families fled out of Norway from their enraged king to Iceland in the year 874, which at that time was but mainly inhabited. 40 years before, Louis the Just put the Icelanders under the protection of Pope Gregory IV, who gave the government of the Iceland Church to Ansgar, Archbishop of Hamburg. But how is it that there is not the slightest spark of Christianity found amongst the Northern Americans, if they are derived from the Iceland Christians? And why did the Icelanders move to colder countries than Greenland and Friesland, or their own native soil, which is for the most part not inhabited? Concerning Greenland and Friesland, it is known by our English navigators that they are joined together, both to Northern America, but not without vast bays and inlets, which between Greenland and America are obstructed with floating castles of ice, so that the passage is very dangerous and troublesome, if not altogether impossible, as would the journey be by land, because the earth lies so thickly covered with ice and snow, especially the valleys, that no traveller is able to get through. Moreover, that which Grotius says further about the fishermen who first discovered Scotland is grounded on the relation of the Venetian knights, Nicholas and Marcus Zeno, 2 brothers. Year 1380, Nicholas Zeno suffered shipwreck on the Friesland coast. Marcus, informed thereof, steered his course thither. 14 years they spent before they came to Scotland. At last they returned again to Friesland, where Nicholas died, but Marcus, returning home, published his journal, wherein he relates that Estethailand is above 1,000 leagues distant from Friesland, and was discovered by Friesland fishermen that were driven thither by storm. But he has set down many things that have little resemblance of truth, according to what has since been found by credible navigators, and therefore we cannot depend on Zeno's discovery. John de Laet accounts it a great mistake in Grotius that, as a testimony of the Americans' origin out of Norway, he compares their languages. He reckons some places to be northward of Panama, which end their words with the syllable lan. Because the Spaniards have left out the letter D at the end thereof, it is certain that in the Northern America lie Kimatlan, Coatlan, Gescalan, Artlan, Quaxutatlan, Icatlan, Tapatlan, Capatlan, Tenutitlan, Capatlan, Metztitlan, Coatlan, Nextitlan. Besides, most of these names are not of countries, but of towns and villages, and therefore it is in no way fitting to have the termination of land. And it is well known that many American words end with lan, which signifies nothing less than land. For the Mexicans say Puerta Titlan, which signifies at the gate below, or Chichitlantitlan, yet lower Tenochtitlan. This city is also called from her founder Mexis, Mexico, that is, rests on a rock. Moreover, it may not seem strange to anyone that the Northern Americans have remembered only 3 cities out of all the Teutonic tongue, viz., Lan, instead of land. Concerning Greenland, through which the Norwegians are thought to have travelled to America, Lysander witnesses that it was accidentally discovered by one Eric Roder, anno 987, and planted 13 years after. Olaus, king of Norway, placed 2 bishops over the new inhabitants as substitutes for the Archbishop of Dronten. For 4 ages they sailed frequently to Greenland, but since their king was impoverished by war, they left off that trade. We find no evidence in any author that the Norwegians who lived along the seashore ever went to seek a way over the inaccessible snowy mountains of Greenland to this new world. Besides, Grotius stands for the Norwegians as planters upon the testimony of the Mexicans themselves, who told the Spaniards that their ancestors who planted there came from the north, first settling themselves on Esterland, where to this day there are not improbable proofs by several remark that they were a Norwegian colony. In the American city Norumbega, people speak the same language and observe the same customs as the Mexicans. In this by corner are also found some Alavards, Longobards, or Lombards, as they say. Now the Spaniards call that New Mexico because it was last discovered, though indeed it has been crammed with people for 800 years, for the Mexicans of New Mexico do not lie so far northerly as to the northwest, for this Mexico lies in sight of California, which is believed to border on Tartary, or at least be separated from it by a narrow channel. But Norumbega, if ever such a place was, must, according to the west, in Ian records, have been situated where a part of New France lies now. Planted by the English. Between Texas and New Mexico lie an almost immeasurable vast tract of land. Meanwhile, here is not the least sign of this city, Norumbega, to be found. Neither do the inhabitants dwell in cities, but live in tents or movable villages, which change their names as often as their governors. Moreover, the Norwegians could not get to Norumbega by land through Iceland and Greenland to Estetiland because of the vast bays and great midland to sea discovered by the English in their northwestern discoveries. So, leaving Scotland, it was altogether impossible for them to come to Norumbega. Here too may be added what the Mexicans say of themselves, who acknowledge that travelling from the north they did not find an uninhabited country before them, but were forced to make their way by a long and bloody war with the Chichimesin, a savage people that knew neither laws nor religion. The people also dwelling opposite California differ from the customs of the Mexicans, being divided into several people with contrary constitutions and different languages. Grotius screws up his arguments from the likeness of the American speech and customs with the Norwegian, for, says he, there is little difference between pay-god and by-god, or like God, and wager, that is, a fan. In English, lamb, peto, and beke, a brook or rivulet. Both customs and constitutions also have great resemblance. The Mexicans relate that their predecessors only followed hunting, that they divided and reckoned the time not by days, but by nights, and washed their children as soon as they were born in cold water. They are so inclined to gaming that they venture their liberty at it. Everyone is satisfied with one wife, except some of the nobility who oftentimes have more. They throw up high banks in several places to dam out the sea. They believe in the immortality of the soul. Everyone eats at a peculiar table. Most of them go naked, only covering their pudendum with a cloth. Some sacrifice and eat man's flesh, all of which, according to Tacitus, Pliny, Lucan, and other Roman writers, was observed by the ancient Germans, from whom those that inhabit between the Norwegian mountains were extracted. To make the Norwegians the parents of the Northern Americans, John de Laet thus contradicts. It in no way follows that one people takes origin from the other, because here and there are several words found that have the same signification and sound in diverse countries, much less when they must either add, change, or diminish several letters. Moreover, there is no small mistake in the compared words, for pagod is not used all over America. The East Indians about the river Indus call their idol temples pagod or pagode. The word guairara is nowhere used in America but by the Peruvians, and with them not, signifying a fan but a little oven. Neither is llama. A lamb, for before the coming of the Spaniards thither, neither sheep nor lambs were ever seen in Peru, but a wool-bearing beast thus described by Joseph d'Acosta. Llama, says he, is a 4-footed creature that furnishes its master with meat and clothing, and supplies the office of a beast for burdens at no charge for hay or provender, well satisfied with what he finds in the ways or mountain. But the llamas are of 2 sorts, either woolly or short-haired. The first go by the name pecos, the other moro moro. Being not much less than a calf, with a long neck like a camel, but of several colors. For some are white, some black, and others speckled, having an odd look, especially when they are tied and stand still without any motion, staring with goggle eyes on their owner. Sometimes, in a moody humor, upon a sudden taking of a freak, they run up to the top of almost inaccessible mountains, where both the frantic beast and his burden are lost. The Pecos sometimes also take sudden fits and fustian fits, often doing the forward somersault, tumbling over and over with their goods, and will not be raised, their moodiness continuing, with beating even though they cut them to pieces. Wait some hours until their humor is spent. They rise again of their own accord. These beasts are much inclined to a disease called Karesh, or mange, of which they generally die, and because the disease is very contagious, they just bury the infected alive. Grotius also makes a mistake when he compares the Mexican peg with the Dutch BK, for though many Mexican places, mountains and rivers terminate in peaks, yet it signifies not a brook or rivulet, for that they call Tlaxcala. John de Laet also tells how, with great diligence, he found a Mexican dictionary printed by the Spaniards in Mexico to see if there were any words in it that agreed with any of those European languages that he understood, but found none. It is the same case with the customs and constitutions between the Norwegians and Northern Americans. For what concerns hunting, how many people have formerly lived by it? The ancient Germans, and, to this day, the Tartars make it their whole business, excelling in that art above all other nations. Besides, the more serious sort of Mexicans have long scorned to derive themselves from hunting ancestry, but affirm that they found the Chichime in those countries, who were great hunters. The accounting of time by the nights, extracted from the Hebrews, is observed by diverse Eastern people. And although the Germans dipped and washed their children in cold rivers or brooks as soon as they were born, the Mexicans never did it. Instead, the mother lays the child on the 4th day after its birth in an open place of the house, in the middle of which stands a pot full of water covered, with a broom in which they wash the infant. Neither are the Americans so addicted to the vice of gaming as other nations, so that Grotius taxes them too severely as to that point. On the contrary, he too clears them of polygamy, whereas the Mexicans marry as many wives as they please or are able to maintain. Father Martin Perez relates the same of the Sinaloans and other Americans, as well as Corterius of the natives in Nova Francia, which lie nearest to Norway. And why would the Americans need the Germans as their teachers to make dams and banks against floods, since nature and necessity itself instructs it set? And where are any people so ignorant as to ascribe the same event to men and beasts after death? It's true that their manner of eating in America is different, because the people do not converse much together, but they did not go naked, for the Spaniards found them not only neatly dressed, but had a proper name for everything they wore. The Virginians used long shirts, the Floridians used the skins of wild beasts, and towards the north they covered themselves from head to foot in hairy and undressed hides. The sacrificing of men was in former ages spreading far and near over the world, and how far it was practiced here has been already declared at large. Lastly, all Americans are not guilty of eating man's flesh, but that savagery is confined to Southern America. Thus, much has been said to prove that the Norwegians had no hand in planting Northern America. We shall now proceed to inquire who planted the southern parts, from the straits between Panama and Nombre de Dios to the Straits of Magellan. The Peruvians, possessing a large tract of land along the coast of the South Sea, Grotius would thus derive from China. The Peruvians, being of a subtle wit and quick of apprehension, argue sufficiently that they are not extracted from the more northern Americans, but rather from the Chinese, which the several wrecks of Chinese ships found on these coasts sufficiently evident. Accident brought the Chinese expert navigators to this country, separated only by one sea from them. To this we may add their rites of religion, for both worship the sun and call their king the son of the sun. They write no letters, but make characters downwards. Manco Capacis was a Chinese of strange policy who, being informed that his countrymen inhabited fruitful countries on the other side of the South Sea, but without laws or government, sailed over thither and gathered the scattered multitudes in a body and established an hereditary kingdom after the Chinese manner for him and his successors, to which John de Laet answers thus: though the Peruvians exceeded the other Americans in policy, and at the arrival of the Spaniards lived in a handsome order of government, yet they can in no way be compared to the sharp-witted and noble-spirited Chinese. There is no place in Peru where such artificers as those of China bear praise of the whole world. Nowhere such a manner of buildings or cities, nor the least likeness of the Chinese curiosities, as concerning the wrecks found in Peru. I find no credible author that gives an account thereof, for certainly the Chinese could much easier and in a nearer way have come through the Atlantic Sea to the coasts of America, lying to the east of Peru, than steer along the vast and much greater South Sea and endure the horrible storms and vast waves that the European ships are scarcely able to endure, much less the Chinese vessels, which are not so good. The Spaniards who sail yearly from Acapulco to the Philippines are sensible of the great danger which they endure, chiefly by the great gusts of wind near California. Besides, the Peruvians before the arrival of the Spaniards were utterly ignorant of great ships and the use of sails. How could they at once have forgotten that art which they brought with them? Moreover, it is easier to sail from Peru to China than from China to Peru, because the winds under the equinoctial line commonly blow easterly. And it is a greater wonder that the Chinese junks were accidentally driven by storm to Peru because they were never stored with provisions, but for a short voyage, whereas this took 9 months, sailed just to Peru and not to New Spain, which is much closer to China. Why were there no merchants of the Chinese found in Peru, since they went through trade? How come they neglect the navigation they once found? Nor is their sun worship, which was formerly practiced in most parts of the world, of any validity to derive from China, but the contrary is most apparent, for the Peruvians worship their chief god Viracocha, that is, God Almighty, or the creator of all things. The Chinese, if Confucius, an eyewitness, may be credited, the Chinese are divided into 3 sects of religion. The first follow the learned Triantius and acknowledge a king of the heavens, who must only be served as the Chinese sole governor. Royal cities of Nanking and Peking, one consecrated to heaven and the other to earth. The second sect has the name Siequia and serves the idol Omito. The third named Lanzu employs themselves in magic and exorcisms, conjuring up and laying evil spirits, whose horrid representations, when they have stuck upon the walls, make an artificial and dreadful noise, as if hell were broken loose and the house were full of devils, force the evil spirits to enter into images from which they receive no impertinent answers to their questions. Therefore, who will compare this superstition of the Peruvians worshipping of the sun to the Chinese religion, which does no such thing? The Peruvians called their king a lord of the realm and not the son of the sun, as in China, though the Mexicans otherwise worship the sun and, in their manner of adulation, styled Hernando Cortez their conqueror son of the sun. As to what concerns the manner of writing, it is very well known that the Chinese words are all monosyllables, so that they have as many letters as words, which they join so together that they reckon 80,000. But with 10,000 they are able to express themselves in most matters. These characters are contained in their Halpian or dictionary. The ancient Chinese used 17 characters in their writing, some consisting of serpents that, by several wreaths and contentious windings, signified several things, others of all sorts of agrestic tools belonging to husbandry, some characters of the feathers of the bird Pham Haw, others of oysters and worms, or of roots, of herbs, or birds' claws, or of turtles, or of herbs and birds' feathers mingled, or of planets and such like. But what manner of writing or hieroglyphics of theirs resemble those who by their own testimony know neither pen, paper, ink, nor any manner of writing, but reckon the antiquity of time by strung beads, which was observed many ages ago among several nations? Hitherto we have discovered several opinions concerning the origin of the Americans or the first plantation in America. After all, having received no clear or demonstrative satisfaction, we must open our way to further scrutiny. But first, we must confess that contradiction is not difficult. But it is something of work, when we have beaten down a well-fortified opinion, to set up somewhat instead thereof, to stand a permanent and undeniable truth, which will be the harder in regard to the inhabitants of this new world, having no old chronologies concerning their antiquities and first settling there. Yet if we cannot go so far as to assert some probabilities, grounded, as we suppose, upon better reasons, may give more satisfaction. For none will deny but that the generations of mankind being strangely multiplied after the flood, they then living 5 times our ages, and wars not beginning till the known part of the earth was overstocked, jostling for territories, and some thrust quite out, at last found America. Spreading itself to a vast extent, and now found almost everywhere well inhabited, it may be guessed that it was not only planted from the first, but several times replenished since by various nations. Why may not several planters at several times make room for their colonies, encroaching one upon another, either by force or compact, as the French themselves did upon the Gauls, the Normans upon them, the Goths among the Spaniards, the Saxons among the Spaniards, the Saxons among the Britons, and the Normans again upon them? Several people may easily sail over there where the Azores or the Canary Isles lie, so that they are ready, as if designed, for transportation to America. Also, Pliny gives us an account that these islands lay uninhabited in his time. Yet it is well known that after Pliny's time, ruins of buildings were found there, signifying they had been formerly planted, and why might not those ancient inhabitants sail thence to the neighbouring America? Terceira, lying halfway between Spain and America, was frequented by navigators before the birth of our Saviour, and it seems as easy to sail from there to America as from the mainland of Spain there. Add this to the fact that necessity forced the Spaniards to look about them from other countries, for since they lost their victorious champion, Bocchus Agapetus, they were everywhere beaten, being tired out by the Phoenician forces, and that oppression over, they suffered as much under the Romans. Therefore, it seems not strange if a considerable number are removed from thence, that they might live somewhere else in quiet. For which purpose they wanted no conveniences but to rig and set forth stout and sufficient vessels, able to live in those seas, having had long experience from the Phoenician voyagers, whose fleets sailed daily to and fro in several expeditions, from Cadiz and Gibraltar towards these western countries. Hanno himself, their first navigator that way, gives an account of the Gorgons, or the Isles of Cape Verde, a good part of the way to America. And though Britain, Ireland, and the British Orcades lay further from America, something may be said particularly to prove that many ages ago expeditions had been made from thence to the New World, and that the inhabitants of these isles, in former ages, were peculiarly famous for their skill in navigation, insomuch that the Cretans and Phoenicians, emulous of their skill and jealous of their danger, made several attacks and invasions upon these isles, which is the more probable, with many remarks of the Phoenician and Greek language remaining in the denominations of the country, which, take first this account, in the year 1170, when Owain Gwynedd, Prince of Wales, having reigned long and happily in his settled dominions, dying, left several sons who quarrelled with their elder brother, not content with their shares of the principality, nor to be under him, having gotten no mean interests and claims to the whole by their struggles, so weakened one another that they opened a way to the loss of all. Amongst these brothers, Madoc, a prince of a milder disposition, weary of such unnatural dissensions, threw up his share, better content to seek new fortunes abroad, whereupon many were soon persuaded to venture their lives with him, wherever he would please to transport them. So rigging a small fleet, he sailed westward, far beyond Ireland, where at last he discovered an unknown and uninhabited country, but wondrous and pleasant, the air being temperate and the soil most fertile. Glad of this good success, as the story says, he returned, spreading the fame of his new-found land. They might exchange for barren soil, battered and harassed with an endless civil war. No small number flocked to these summons as a most acceptable undertaking, so that soon after he was able to send forth 10 good ships, freighted only with men, women, and children, and all other materials fit for a new plantation, which not long after landed in Accusumil, a country in the north of tracks of Christianity, a people that worshipped the cross, but knew no reason why or wherefore they adored that sign of our redemption. Now, some will say that this worship of the cross is no argument to prove that the British Christians first planted in North America, but what will time and change of place do, where transplanted people keep no records, so they forget not only religion, laws, and customs, but who they were and from whence they came? Oblivion, first mutilating and at last swallowing up all of which take this one late precedent. In the year 1598, the Duke de la Roche obtained leave from the Finch King to transport a colony of volunteers to New France. In his way, he landed 50 men on the island of Sable to rest his passengers, and that he might better and with more ease explore the country, and when resolved where to settle, then to fetch them off, who accordingly as designed soon after returning thither, was met with so violent a storm that, not being able to weather the Isle of Sable where he left his people, he lost his whole expedition and was driven back to a French harbour. When he no sooner arrived, he was so highly charged that he was cast into prison, when those he had left neglected upon the island were not once so much as thought of. In this interim, they never expected to hear more of their captain, who lived in a wild and miserable condition, feeding upon fish, and sometimes wild swine without bread, drink, or salt. When the Baron of Liry went with letters patents to be governor of Nova Francia, and by stress of weather in his voyage was forced to put in at Sable, where he found the remainder of La Roche's people, who, being from 50 reduced to 12, having clad themselves in sea-wolf skins, they had not only lost their former French civilities, but also their manners, their religion, much of their language, and who they were, as if metamorphosed into bestial savages. And although we have already discussed the improbability of inhabiting America, either by accident, storm, or set purpose, yet it may be possible that it might happen, for as the several virtues of plants, herbs, precious stones, and minerals, though strangely occult and so altogether unknown, that what could never be found by art, mere chance, has brought to light, and their wondrous qualities some casual accident has made apparent. So strange and remote countries, never to be found in our charts or maps, nor registered in any story, seamen bound to their intended harbours have stumbled on by chance, either hoodwinked by blind mists or forced upon by pertinacious weather, of which America may be her own witness, for how was Columbus stirred up by incitations of the journals of a sea captain dying in his house, driven on the American islands by foul weather. Although from the aforementioned places, and after the same manner, America might be furnished with inhabitants, so it also gives us a more certain assurance that the planting of America was not only soon after the flood, but that they came also thither by land. And how strangely would it be against the majesty and wisdom of divine providence to leave half the universal globe, a world fully supplied with all sorts of creatures, fit for food and service, plants, herbs, and the richest minerals, like a house newly built and well furnished, without a master, or any inhabitant, namely man, who being of celestial extract, should be able to acknowledge and glorify the Creator by admiring the creature in his great work. Besides, the confused notions and fables of giants, perpetrators of all manner of crimes and wallowing in all kinds of sensual debaucheries, are always remembered among the antiquities of the Americans, and that they had some slender hints of ancient truth, not only of the giants before the flood, but of those that soon after the rank fatness of the earth produced and fed to that pitch of arrogance that the covenanting brethren defied God, fortifying themselves to fight him by the advantage of their long congested pile, Babel, which in a short time was transported by the heathen poet into their gigantomachia, heaping hills on hills like the American traditions, from which we may conjecture that they came thither in the time of Noah, for why may not anyone believe, when Noah lived 300 years after he landed on Mount Ararat, that he took care of people in the world, and who will make him ignorant of this new world, who, living 500 years before, might not improbably, by his own industry and the help of the former long-lived patriarchs, been well able to make a general survey of the old, and he could better furnish America, it being nearer Mount Ararat than supply Italy, Spain, Germany, or any northern territories in Europe, so that America might be known to the first people after the flood, nay, inhabited by them, though since then the knowledge was lost. Pliny, complaining of the supine negligence and stupendous sloth which reigned then and long before, as he had observed, among all people and in every place, who were so far from making inquiry after discoveries of lands for new plantations, that they lost the old when they had begun to settle. Though under the greatest serenity of peace, the sea, by that means, lying open beyond what any juncture of former times could be proud of, yet the Fortunate or Canary Islands were in the first ages after Noah frequented with vessels, which in later times were altogether neglected till Guillaume Betancourt, a gentleman of Picardy, brought them again to be taken notice of by a fresh trade. Dragon that kept the golden fruit with constant vigils is nothing but an allusion to the sea, which with serpentine embraces not only secured these scattered isles, but swallowed up several adventurers that too hardy made their unhappy approaches for discovery. Another allegation for the planting of America by land, both whose sides are washed on the east and west by the South and Atlantic Ocean, may be thus probably made out. The Atlantic rolls over with almost fathomless waters, 3,000 leagues of ground. The South Sea not much less, which, well, maybe being indeed but one continued sea, encompassing until meeting there the universal ball. Hence springs a likelihood that America might be planted from the southern parts, from the Straits of Magellan and Le Maire. Peter Fernandez de Quar relates that he and a commander, Lodowick Paez Le Torres, saw part of the south country, and in it innumerable inhabitants, whites, blacks, sallows, with long, black, curled, woolly, and yellow hair. They know no walls or fortresses for defence, laws or kings, but are divided into tribes. They indeed use bows, arrows, clubs, and a kind of spear. Their houses are covered with palm tree leaves. Their household stuff consists only of a few earthen pots and such trinkets, yet they have some little skill in weaving, and though they go naked, pride themselves in necklaces and bracelets made of mother of pearl, but these for their complexions and constitution of body customs, manners are rather derived from the Americans than they from them. And therefore we must seek for their origin from the north, from which are but two ways, one from Iceland and Greenland, which Grotius endeavours to prove but contradicted, the other out of Tartary, which certainly was the first nursery from whence the Americans were transplanted. Tartary, or Tatary, so called from the river Tatar, which runs through the country Mongol into the Northern Ocean, covers a great part of the terrestrial globe. The Lesser Tartary makes out a considerable part of Europe. This Great Tartary, which is 1,000 leagues long and 600 broad, reckons 5 chief provinces, namely, the Wild Tartary, inhabited by herdsmen, Sagatai, of which the metropolis is Samarkand, famous for the mighty Tamerlane, next Turkestan, then Khitai, which the great Chaim commands, and, lastly, Old Tartary, according to Andreas Caesariensis, the habitation of Gog and Magog. Now we must inquire from what Tartars the Americans are extracted. Morneus, Postellus, Genabradus, Potterus, and others are of the opinion that the Tartars, which about the year 1228, under the command of Genghis Khan, overspread the earth like a deluge, were the successors of the 10 tribes of Israel, which were carried into captivity to Assyria by Salmanazar. The name Tartary, or rather Tataria, seems to be some testimony thereof, because it signifies in the Syrian or Hebrew tongue remnants or remainders, as seemingly because these Tartarians were remainders of the aforementioned tribe. The northern Tartary herdsmen preserve to this day the names Dan, Zabulon, and Naphtali, wherefore we need not to admire why so many Jews are found in Russia, Sarmatia, and Livonia. The nearer to Tartary, the more Jews there are. Circumcision has long been observed among them before Muhammad brought in his new law. It seems that Muhammad ordered the circumcision and other laws, according to Moses, to be observed by the northern people, because in his time they began to rebel, so they might better be kept in awe by their new religion. Johannes Leon Clavius relates that in Livonia near Riga he heard the wild natives called Leti, not without great admiration, go crying along the highways and fields with a doleful voice, Jeru, Maskolu. It is believed that they mourn for Jerusalem and Damascus, but by their long continuance in the vast wildernesses, they have forgotten their religion and laws, and what else might enable us to tell who they were? Several learned authors question this removal of the Israelites out of Assyria. To Tartary, though to our judgment, their arguments are too weak to take from them the footing they have gotten there. Yet nevertheless, the Israelites are not to be taken for the planters of America, for why else is Judaism not as well found in America as in Tartary? But it is already shown that America was inhabited long before the dispersion of the Israelites. Now, to shut up all, it is evident that the first planters of America were not Europeans from the dissimilitude of the people, both in their complexions, language, and persons, nor Africans, because that in all the far-spreading country of America not one Negro is to be found, except a few near there. River Martha, in the little territory Quarequa, which must be driven thither from the Guinea coast by storm, so that Asia, the mother of all people, only remains to be the implanter of our America, whose western coast, opposite to Asia, is more inhabited than to the east, where it respects Europe. Moreover, Armenia, out of which, by Noah's progeny, the whole earth was repeopled, borders on Scythia, now called Tartary, and Tartary faces America, separated only by the Straits of Anian, though some are of the opinion that out of the south into the frozen sea there is no passage through the straits, as we have already proved the contrary. How come all those voracious and poisonous beasts into America, if it is clearly separated from Asia by sea? It deserves here to be related to what happened to Henry Cornelissen Shape and William Bijleveld, sailing from Batavia to discover the Tartaric river Polisange, but were taken and carried prisoners to the Japan court at Jeddo, being commanded there by order of the council to give an account of a Japan map or card, which was laid before them and contained the provinces of Japan, Amboina, the Molucca Islands, Manila, the South Sea, Borneo, Celebes, Malacca, Tartary, Formosa, Korea, and the vast and mountainous country or desert of Jesso, separated from Japan by the Straits of Songa. Though toward the north, it joins Japan in the province of Okyo, and beginning in 47 degrees, run northeast towards America, but they could not possibly find the Straits of Ananian. But on the contrary, the promontory of Tartary, namely the province Kataya or Katui, lay in the same, parallel with northern America. Here too may be added that Asia has no territory anywhere which may more easily with numerous colonies supply America than this part of Tartary, as well for the vastness of the country, to which no other can compare. As for the increasing of the inhabitants, who does not admire that according to Michaelon Lithauer, there is scarcely a city in Tartary that boasted less than 1,000 temples? And to see Kanguista, the first king of Tartary about the year 1200 in arms, and his successor Hokata, following his father's bloody footsteps while he prepared his sons with 3 vast armies. The eldest son, Jachis, marched westward with 30,000 horses. Bartho drew with as great an army towards the north. Tagladaius, being the youngest, fell into the Moors' country above Egypt. Hokata himself marched victoriously into North America, subdued a great part of the Persian kingdom, and beat the Turks, led by the general Goniata with a great army in the year 1241, as Jacob Planensis and Benedictus Samata, 2 monks sent by Pope Innocent to Hokata, witness. The great number of the Tartars or Scythians may appear by the several peoples spread far and near over Tartary. Pliny reckons some of them, namely Orchetes, Nuri, Geloni, Thossagetes, Budini, Basilides, Godini, Basilides, Agathyrsi, Nomades, Anthropopgi, Hyperboreae, Arymphi, Sishanthi, Georgi, Sacares, and others. What number would the inhabitants make up that live in America, in Tenerife, Virginia, Florida, New Spain, Guadalajara, Guatemala, Terra Firma, New Granada, Peru, Chile, Rio de la Plata, Brazil, Guayon de la Plata, Brazil, Guyana, New Andalusia? It will be worth our time to compare the likeness between the Scythians and Northern Americans. Both of them are differentiated with special marks of a more than ordinary and natural distance between the eyes, which much alters the whole air of the face, and the plumpness and swelling of the cheeks summit above the cheekbone. Most of these are of a middle stature, having downy hair upon their chin, like the callow feathers of an unfledged bird. Lastly, as the Tartars, they differ amongst themselves in their customs, yet in several things they agree one with another, according as they are governed by others, and yet other princes, some powerful and some weaker, according as everyone's power is more or less, bear so great a respect and stand so much in awe of their governor, that if commanded to leap from a rock and break their necks, they instantly obey. The same is observed by the Tartars. The first king, Kanguista, commanded the 7 princes of his realm to murder their sons with their own hands, which they all readily perform. In Popena, they live to this day like some Tartars, without laws or lawgivers who change their places by turns. From the great increase, or the Tartars, the Americans no ways differ. Bartholomeus de las Casas wrote to Charles V that the Spaniards in a few years, only on the islands Cuba, Hispaniola, Naco, Honduras, in Venezuela, and New Spain, destroyed above 2,600,000 men, besides the slaughter that was made in Peru, Brazil, Rio de la Plata, and other places which far exceed the aforementioned numbers. Polygamy is still in use, both among the Tartars and Americans. Both acknowledge the immortality of the soul. Both, like cannibals, eat and sacrifice human flesh. How famous amongst the ancients was the altar of Diana in Taurica, Chersonesus, where several men were daily sacrificed. How delicate, according to Sabellicus, did the Tartars account for their dishes, sauced and served with human gore? Strabo relates that the ancient people account it an honourable death to be chopped in pieces, and their flesh served up in commons. Those that die by age, a natural death, are despised like malefactors, and as a punishment according to their demerits, left in the open fields, a prey to birds and beasts. Some delight in that loathsome gorging themselves with men's flesh. Others, on the contrary, not only detest humans, but all manner of flesh. And just so the Americans are distinguished, for although the Caribs, Brazilians, the inhabitants of New Spain, New Granada, St. Martha and others sacrifice and eat men, yet as many abhor and detest that odious diet and abominable custom. Giles Flesher, Queen Elizabeth's agent in Moscow, relates that in 1588, Kinesh Morsi, grandson of the governor of the Crim Tartars, made his entrance there with a retinue of 300 noblemen and 2 ladies, of which one was the widow of his deceased brother. Of their coming, sent him 2 slaughtered horses, whose sides and haunches they feasted on, as we on fallow deer. Most of the Tartars use no manner of letters or characters. In the voyage made into Persia, they first learned to make letters, just so it is in America. Their bemoaning of the dead ends in 1 month, both by the Tartars and Americans. With a person of quality, the Tartars bury a live servant. The same custom is observed by some Americans, and so much do they agree in a savage and rude life that merchandising and mechanics are little regarded. Eisen the American acknowledges the Tartars for being rude people in their religion, habits, and dwellings, and yet in all these the Americans differ but very little. Common is it amongst them to worship the devil? Along the river Sagadahok, the inhabitants are miserably tormented by every new moon, tormented by an evil spirit called Tanto. In the temples in Virginia, the horrible images of the devils Okey and Meneto still remain. Not a house in Mexico, but has a peculiar chapel set apart for this, their supposed holy but damnable adoration of the devil. Others in Virginia believe that there is a great and supreme deity which is everlasting and forever. The Tartars also are of the like persuasion, but this opinion Grotius has laid a strong and dangerous battery against, that America could not be peopled by the Tartars, because the Americans, before the Spaniards coming thither, had never seen any horses, whereas the Tartars use no beast more, either in peace or war, nor can less one. Tartarian forces do not only consist of horses, but the wealth of this country is reckoned up in the numerous breeds of horses and several studs of mares. Some of the nobles keep 1,000 horses. None, though never so poor, but keep 2 or 3, and beggars their mount crave alms and charity of the people. When they remove their habitations, their horses carry their provisions and tent. Gusted with garlic, which satisfies hunger and thirst, and the red liquor which they tap warm from their veins, serves them to help digestion and heighten their humour, instead of the blood of the grape, our sweet wine. The swiftest rivers, though raging and precipitated with land floods, dare adventure swimming their horses over, hanging naked by their manes and guiding them by a slipped rein whither they please. To their tails they tie their saddles and other necessities, bound up in rushes. When a person of quality prepares to cross any river, they tie 2 horses' tails to their tails, and both their backs fasten a mat pleated of rushes to sit on. When they are stopped at any broad river or standing lake, they kill and flay their worst horses, then turning the skins inside out and, they stretch them open with the ribs, which stand like the bales of tilted wherry, and thus furnished, serves them for a boat to carry 8 persons. When they take the field, going to war, not any but musters 3 horses, which makes their armies, when drawn out in campaign, show much bigger than indeed they are. And though many of them are killed in the wars or slain for food, yet the European Tartars pay yearly 40,000 horses too. The Russians, from whence Grotius thus argues, if America joined to Tartary, then the horses which run wild at grass might easily have found America themselves, seeking to improve their pasture, and have gone from one country into the other, as it appears that since the Spaniards transported horses to America, they are dispersed over the highest. mountains out of one province into the other. Or if the Straits of Anian run between both, the Tartars never were navigators, and suppose they had been, they would not have crossed without horses, without which they knew not how to subsist. Now and in former times abounded in horses, yet must we grant that it has always been so, or that the ancient Scythians, who we first planted in America, had such frequent use of them as the Tartars now. This may be controversial, for that these Scythians planted there in the non-age of time, presently after the flood, the use of horses was unknown, which the ancient poets testify by their fiction of centaurs, who when first seen, the horse and rider were taken for one creature. Mistake the Mexicans had when they saw the mounted Spaniards, 1,000 running away from one cavalier. Thank you for your time, because it is very appreciated. Don't forget to subscribe so that we can continue this journey together. America's The Explorer's Heaven, Part 3, next.